morning and welcome to this week's episode of Climate Coffee. We're here in an actual cafe today, which always makes a nice welcome change. So we're pumped up on caffeine. We've got things to discuss, including COP26 and some of the changes we're seeing, not just in terms of the expectations of delivering climate regulation and standardization, but also mechanisms through which poorer countries can actually be supported by richer countries to make sure that climate adaptation and resiliency are built in. We also have some new TCFD guidelines, some new information coming from the Bank of England in terms of a roadmap for greening the financial system, and more evidence why it's really, really important to have proper standards and proper regulation around climate, around executive pay, many of these issues that can get greenwashed today. So let's get into Climate Coffee. Let's go. So, as we're approaching COP26, we're only 2 weeks away from Glasgow. Firstly, it's really hard to get a hotel. Secondly, it's going to be really hard to get a train because in Scotland, I believe that Scottish Rail are striking during that weekend and that week now, which is unfortunate. But anyways, on to the actual event. There's some really interesting analysis coming out. There's an article in The Economist which gives a great overview. It talks about some of the things that we want to see out of COP26. It includes more regulation in terms of maybe having the US announce something around setting climate disclosures, as well as some of the mechanisms that we're putting into place, including ratchets that are actually coming from Paris originally. And if you think about it, going back to COP21, there was a much clearer expectation and guidance in terms of what was going to be delivered, but actually there wasn't really this time around as much clear and concise information on here's what we're going to do at COP26. There's a lot of hype, but how does that translate? Some of the things that are going to happen, the Economist article points out the NDCs, which are nationally determined contributions, which are effectively, there's going to be a deadline on countries telling you what they're going to put in. And this is in the context as well. There's an article from Reuters which talks about the expectations of poorer countries for the $100 billion in annual payments made by rich countries to poorer countries to support them in terms of climate adaptation and resiliency. They're wondering, is this actually going to happen? Are there ways to track this and measure this? Because we've heard this story many times before. One of the reasons why we're having COP26 in person is because in previous versions, when everyone gets on a Zoom call, some of these smaller countries don't get to get their points across, they don't get to have their moment, and it's really important that these smaller voices are heard. Not just because because of things like wanting to drive developmental targets and kind of supporting, but actually that many of these poorer countries are the ones most exposed to climate change, whether it's rising sea levels for smaller island nations, whether it's wildfires affecting these countries or drought affecting African countries. We have to hear these voices and we have to make sure that these issues are being addressed. Another really interesting article that came across our desks this week is directly related to that, and that's in the form of CIDs, debt for climate swaps for small islands, effectively providing a mechanism for reducing debt and increasing climate adaptation and resiliency. There's an article in Nature that goes through some of these. It's an academic journal. It's got some really interesting insights. Going from the global stage, looking at things like the carbon tax, which was mentioned in the FT very briefly, and these wider COP26 issues. There's new TCFD guidance, which is effectively calling out a couple of things. Number one, they're calling for mandating of climate emissions monitoring by using the PCAF, which is the Principles for Carbon Accounting in Finance, I believe. And they're recommending that these guidelines be integrated within the TCFD reports to make sure that emissions are being monitored and captured efficiently. A really interesting point that we come across at SUST is actually saying, sure, there are ways of doing carbon accounting today, but actually are they the best ways of really measuring and monitoring methane, CO2, SO2, NO2 in the atmosphere? So satellite technology and geospatial technology and deep learning techniques are an amazing new way of addressing these issues, not just because they can provide a level of granularity, but also the cadence. Most of the carbon accounting today is 18 to 24 months out of date because it comes out of an annual report, then the analysis is done, and then finally you get the results. With things like satellite drive data, it can be bi-weekly or even quicker. So GHGSat are one of the companies developing methane monitoring capabilities. They're going to be at COP26 too. Just a point to say that actually, yes, this PCAF inclusion in the TCFD is very important. but it's not the only thing that matters. And actually we need better data, we need better data sources, and we need better ways of getting this data into the hands of people at financial institutions and corporates who can do something about their carbon emissions. We also have a new roadmap from the Bank of England in the UK, calling for ways to green the financial system, making sure that we have better ways to approach data and the ways we process the data and the ways that we inform people within the financial sector. We're going to be doing a little bit more of a deep dive into that, but it came out just yesterday on Monday morning, so we're looking forward to digging in on that. Another form of regulatory news which I think is interesting, we've had the TCFD, we've talked about the COP26, we also have news in the SFDR, which is for asset managers who have assets in Europe. And in Bloomberg there's an article basically saying that people won't hit it. The European Fund and Asset Management Association, or IFAMA, says the industry isn't being given enough time and enough information to adapt to these new standards, and they're saying that, hey, many of these asset managers are just not going to disclose any sustainable assets because they're not ready for this regulation. Personally, we think that there really is an opportunity to comply with this, and actually there's an opportunity to really be leaders in this space, so we expect to see many of the kind of forward-thinking asset managers doubling down and making sure they're compliant, and we'll very quickly see where the leaders are and where the laggards are. Lastly, in all of this context of regulatory mechanisms and all this context of standardization and better data and avoiding greenwashing, there is unfortunately a big story on greenwashing. The Washington Post highlights big corporate payouts basically for pretty crappy targets in terms of ESG. Marathon Petroleum, the CEO got a $272,000 bonus the same year that 1,400 gallons of oil was spilled, which kind of seems totally bonkers. And really highlights the need for having not just increased shareholder pressure like we've seen with the engine and Shell and some of these big petroleum companies, but also to make sure that internally there's this pressure, but also externally we're holding them to account, and we're introducing technologies such as emissions monitoring, such as CO2 monitoring, such as SO2 monitoring at a global scale to make sure that this information is really coming across and we don't have bullshit payouts like the one we're seeing at Marathon. That's all from this episode of Climate Coffee. Make sure you look out for the Climate Expressos, which we're going to be doing throughout the week, where we're going to give you quick 30-second snapshots into some of these news stories, give you a bit more flavor on them. You can find them both on LinkedIn, on YouTube, on TikTok, on Instagram stories, and on podcasting platforms like Spotify and Apple and wherever else you get your podcasts. So I'm Josh Gilbert, CEO at SAS Global and presenter on Climate Coffee. I'm going to go have a coffee and we'll catch you very soon. Cheers. Bye.